evidence-based practices and what are things that we would expect the federal government and the state government to invest in. I mean, part of what you just heard is I do work in an area called positive behavior support, looking at building, how do you help schools to become and build more effective social communities? That's a big challenge. How do we use what we're learning about behavior analysis? So between now and 10:30, here's the starting point of moving forward. I'm going to argue that there are 9 core features of single case methods. So I want you to be able to say, here's what makes something a single case analysis. Second, I'm going to argue that in the past 10 years, one of the biggest changes is we've gone from sort of a field where there were a bunch of people who sort of did things, and if they were from Kansas, it was good, and if they were from Virginia, it was bad, right? And we, instead, this is really, and for those of you who are young scholars, I want you to think about the difference between what you do to gain personal knowledge. You do things so that you personally have a sense of how to help teachers, how to help families, how to help young kids with autism. But there's a difference thing that I want you to do. I want you to think about, as scholars, your contribution to the academy. I want you to think about the extent to which you can say, I not only learned something, but I learned something that I'm going to put on the table and say, this is a piece of knowledge that we will all agree to, right? When do we as a group agree that we have understood that this is a fundamental law of human behavior that we can use? And I'm going to argue that the only way we do that is by, as a community, coming together, having a group hug, and agreeing on what the standards of effective science are. And until we can agree on what those standards are, we're all basically just doing things that help us to understand, write for publications. Publications are good, you need them to get promoted, but that's not really what the goal is. I want you to do things in the next 5 years that will actually advance what we as a field understand about the basic nature of human behavior. That's what I want you to use single case methods to do. All right, so if we're going to do that, what are the standards that the field is coming up with? I mean, to what extent do we actually have, a set of rules? I'm going to argue, for example, that A-B designs, A baseline, B intervention, are cute, they're very neat, we like them, they're good descriptive, but they are not science. They are a portion of the descriptive nature of what we do. They're not experimental. So if we say, I want you to think today about design standards. What are the standards for organizing and preparing a study? And then evidence standards. What are the standards for determining if the design demonstrates something of significance? So we're going to separate design from evidence, and then partly we're going to start putting those in the context of at least 3 major design classes. Reversal designs, ABAB, multiple baseline designs that cut across a group of individuals or situations, and alternating treatment designs. So those of you who are in the autism group, you'll love the lesson. Alternating treatment designs, because that's what you got to use to do a functional analysis. All right, so between now and 10:30, you got it? That's what we're going to do. All right, so here we go. So if you were to say, let's put a little bit of context. So I'm going to argue that historically, single case designs have been relegated to a relatively small niche within the field of education and psychology, primarily used in medicine and behavior analysis. In the early 2000s, one of the things that started happening is people started saying, look, if we're going to move beyond this just being a little group of people, we're going to really talk about using single case methods with breadth. We need to actually define what are the standards. How does that actually work? And the Council for Exceptional Children, the American Psychological Association, a group of people with the acronym SCRIBE out of Australia, all came together and started defining what are the standards that we would really look for. So let's agree on measurement, on subject selection, and things of that nature. In the mid-2008, 10, 12 period, the Institute of Education Science, the U.S. Department of Education, actually pulled together a group of people and built design standards and evidence standards that were interesting. They didn't do it necessarily for the field. They did it to say, what will we fund? So in one sense, I want you to think about becoming a good scientist. I want you to think about doing brilliant research. But I also want you to write grants. I want you to write grants that will get funded. And one of the reasons why coming to this today is going to be worthwhile, we're going to share with you the standards that it takes to get funded by NSF and IES if you want to write grants that will go forward. So part of what I want you to be thinking of is the federal government is coming up with rules. Professional associations are coming up with standards. And what is rapidly happening now is journal editors are adopting those same standards. So essentially, when you have professional organizations, the federal government, and journal editors and reviewers using a common set of rules, that's the way in which you actually change the world. Now recently, one of the themes that has run through is this whole thing about analysis. So single case methods have historically used visual analysis, looking at graphs and determining the extent to which they demonstrated an effect. And that's cute and that's fun, but it turns out different people will see different things unless they're very well trained. So in part, there was an effort to come up with statistical methods for assessing single case, real-time data, serial data. And the initial attempts to do that proved, I would say, only marginally successful. There were violations of basic principles that were troublesome. One of the really exciting things that's happened in the past 10 years has been the application of much more sophisticated statistical modeling towards the analysis of real-time sequenced data. And it is the application of those models that Dave Rindskopf is going to be able to present to us later this morning, this afternoon. So in part, one of the things that we are looking for, so I want you to have a sense of what is the advance right now with respect to where, when, and how we use single case methods. What are the ways in which you set up practical, effective, and experimental designs? How do you do visual analysis of those designs? But also, how do you make sense of those designs statistically? So those of you who are coming in as measurement and design theorists, all right, I want you to take everything you've got, listen to me, and let me push you out of your comfort zone, right, in terms of saying to what extent does that actually work, and then listen to David and feel comfortable, good, and true again. All right, so it will all basically come together. Okay, make sense? Is that what you thought you were getting into? All right, so here we go. So first off, one of my other real hopes is that many of you within the next 10 years will be in situations where you're actually teaching single case methods. So in part, as you're going forward and you're doing that, I want you to come to this. First off, be really clear. Most people walk into a course on single case design thinking that it's like case studies where we work with Emily and make things work. Part of what I want to argue, single case methods that we're going to talk about the rest of the day are experimental designs. They are designs to demonstrate a causal or functional relation between manipulation of an independent variable and predicted change in a dependent variable. So we are not talking about purely descriptive data. We're actually getting to the point where you're making inferences about the relationship. One of the things that's interesting, though, and I want you to really, I'm going to push this. I want to go beyond the demonstration that two things are related, and I want you to be able to describe the mechanism that's responsible for the effect. So the most exciting thing to me about single case methods is the level of precision that you gain. So the part of what I want you to be able to do is to start with a logic model that says, here's a phenomenon, right? Here's the thing we're interested in. Here are all the pieces that affect that. This is the piece that we're actually going to manipulate to determine how that changes. It's one thing to be able to say, if I manipulate this, I will get an effect there. That's great. That's good. But I also want you to be able to say why. What is the actual behavioral effect? Is it due to negative reinforcement? Is it due to beta endorphin release? Is it due to what mechanism is actually involved? All right, second, the thing that we really love. We use the individual as the unit of analysis. Now, all science can make that argument. I mean, you can go back to Socrates and you can get that effect. The difference is, part of what we're going to do is, when you do science, you're always struggling with the fact that you've got this massive amount of context and variability, and you want to control the variability. One way to do that is to hold the person in the setting constant over time. Do that long enough until you can identify a pattern, and then ask, what does it take to change the pattern? The real difference is that we're not describing an event at a moment in time. We're describing a pattern that is sufficiently predictable that we believe that change in that pattern is socially important. Now, we're going to come back to that over and over again. The key is, I want you to use the individual, everything about her, right? All these genetics, all this experience, as the constant, and then do the change. And if you're interested in looking at teachers, you're looking at that teacher in that context. But one of the things we can also do, we're interested, for example, in changing classroom social culture. I can use classroom as the unit of analysis. So one of the things that we might do is we might actually randomly select 7 students, and a data point would be the composite of those 7, and each day I would use that as the data point. That would then count as the class becomes the unit. So be careful about how you actually interpret this term individual. You identify the unit of analysis. In most cases, it's an individual human being, because what we're interested in is the study of human behavior. But it doesn't necessarily need to be. Tony Bigley actually has used entire communities in single case methods, looking at strategies for reducing smoking use, especially in youth. Third, independent variables actively manipulated. So this is not just watching what happens, it's actively manipulating the independent variable, as you do with almost all of science. Repeated measurement of the dependent variable. So part of what's going to be important, and this actually is both a strength and a limitation. The issues that you want to study are, in almost all cases, going to be things that you can measure multiple times. So you want to be able to develop something that you can measure rhythmically, because the issue is not to describe an individual at a moment, but a pattern at a series of moments. So it's change over time that is critical. Now, part of what is really important, the vast majority of studies that use single case methods involve direct observation. They aren't studies that are doing test and measurement in the traditional sense. Part of what we typically are doing is you're actually watching the phenomenon in real time. And that's a big issue. The expense of collecting direct observation data mitigates having 200 participants. So those are some of the logistics variables that are involved. Now, one of the big things, and something that gets missed a lot, is the heart of single case methods starts by really understanding what a baseline is. A baseline is a documented pattern of performance that documents a problem you want to solve. So it's not just an occurrence, it's a pattern. And building patterns is very different than simply at one moment in time saying, this is what we vote on. I want you to think about the pattern of eating, the pattern of social initiation, the pattern of play that you see in children. One of the things we know, for example, is when kids with autism enter a new space, they will scan the space, identify a preferred object, and lock onto it and go to it. They miss a huge amount of the social and practical context because of overstimulus selectivity. Typical kids will sit and scan, and they will gain a huge amount of additional information before they actually make a decision. They also will change what they do much more easily.